Israel intensifies military operations in Gaza. That's despite the UN's top court ordering it to immediately halt its assault on Rafah. It's not the first time Israel has refused to comply with an order from the World Court. So what's the point of these measures and how can they be enforced? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. The International Court of Justice has ordered Israel to stop its assault on Rafah. The order is one of three issued by the UN's top court in the genocide case brought by South Africa against Israel over its war on Gaza. Israel has long declared it plans to intensify its assault on the southern city, saying it's necessary to dismantle Hamas. And it appears it plans to follow through with that strategy. The ICJ's rulings are final and legally binding, but it doesn't have a way to enforce them. So, does this latest order carry any weight? And will it affect events on the ground? And how will Prime Minister Netanyahu manage increased pressure at home and abroad? We'll explore these questions with our guests in just a moment. But first, this report by Katia Lopez-Horoyan.
It's a significant move for the UN's top court, a landmark emergency ruling ordering Israel to stop its assault on Rafah.
Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part.
But shortly after the International Court of Justice issued its ruling, Israeli forces intensified their attacks, wiping out entire neighborhoods. The ruling is part of a wider legal case that began with South Africa accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza. Many Palestinians doubt any of the court's orders will change things or stop the government of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from moving forward with the offensive.
I hope Israel will comply, but it hasn't cared about courts, rulings, or even its allies in the past.
Israel will continue the massacres. Israel is a state above the law, and no one can stop it.
As part of the ruling, Israel was ordered to reopen the Rafah border crossing and allow aid into Gaza. Famine is already affecting parts of the north, and the World Health Organization says it can spread across the Strip fast. Israeli officials have condemned the ICJ's ruling. The government says it's defending itself and fighting Hamas, and some Israelis agree.
The fact that they're even having this conversation is quite ludicrous, to be honest. I think that we have women, young women, we have men, we have elderly individuals that have been taken hostage. And
while Israel is a signatory to the Geneva Conventions, the ICJ has no means to enforce its orders. Many analysts now question whether the ruling, like other legal motions, will be dismissed by Israel, and if so, if there will be consequences.
States can choose to take countermeasures against other states. Nonviolent countermeasures would include things like economic sanctions, for example, in order to induce enforcement. All of that depends, obviously, on the political will in the situation.
For now, Palestinians in Gaza must wait to see if the ICJ's court orders will extend beyond words. Katia Lopez-Horoyan, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, let's now bring in our guests for today's show. Joining us in occupied East Jerusalem is Mohammad Dahleh, who's a lawyer and a founder of an East Jerusalem law firm that practices in the Israeli and Palestinian legal systems. In Tel Aviv, Alon Liel, a former Israeli diplomat who served as Israel's ambassador to South Africa. And in London, Willian Schabas, he's an international law expert and a professor at Middlesex University. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us on Inside Story. A warm welcome to all of you. Mohammad Dahleh, if I can start with you. A legally binding order from the International Court of Justice for Israel to stop its offensive on Rafah. Are you at all hopeful the Israelis will heed this call at some point in time? So far, it doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, it hasn't been the case, but I think that the Israeli army and the Israeli government cannot continue to ignore international law, in this case, a specific international court order. This is a clear order this time, and it talks about a specific area, the Rafah area. And I think that this time with the warrant orders, the arrest orders by the ICC, also waiting for Benjamin Netanyahu and Gallant, I think that the Israeli government will think twice this time when they decide on their future actions in Rafah. So it is binding. Israel hasn't been following international law in the past, but I think with this current order, they will treat it in a different way. I don't think that the Israeli government can continue to violate international law, can continue not to comply with orders issued by the International Court of Justice, the highest court in the world, and get away with it. I think this time they know that the time has come for Israel really to comply with these orders and to comply with international law. And if they don't do so, then the risks of arrest warrants for the two gentlemen that we spoke about and maybe others, the risk is getting higher and higher.
Okay, Alon Liel, your thoughts. Will Netanyahu completely ignore this order? Will the Israeli government continue to defy the highest court of international law?
In Israel, the interpretation is different. The Israeli government sees the order as to stop the violence once or if it is inflicting damage on civilians. And the Israeli government say we are not inflicting any damage or casualties on civilians, and we'll go on with the war in Rafah. I think although Israel has a different interpretation, it will be very cautious, especially when it comes to civilians. But I don't think Israel intends to end the war. What can maybe force Israel to do so is if these orders go to the UN Security Council for a vote, and we'll need another American veto, then a new procedure will start.
Okay, I'll ask you a little bit more about what we can expect at the UN Security Council in a moment. Let me bring in Willian Schabas into the conversation. William, Alon Liel says there in Israel that there's a very different interpretation of this law. But as Mohammad Dahleh said, it's a very clear order this time from the International Court of Justice, a very specific ruling, unlike the two previous ones. The court is ordering Israel to stop the military operation in Rafah, to allow humanitarian aid in through Rafah and other crossings. How much weight does this ruling carry, despite Israel ignoring previous rulings of the court?
Well, I totally agree. I think the ruling and the order from the court couldn't be much clearer than it is. And the idea that Israel can interpret this in some way that allows it to continue with its military offensive is quite preposterous. And I think the whole world will see that. Of course, it's clear now that Israel doesn't intend to comply with it, whatever contrived interpretation it develops about the order. And as everyone knows, there is not an enforcement mechanism as such. The enforcement
So what's the purpose then of these measures, William Schabas, if they're going to be ignored?
Well, you don't know that they're going to be ignored until you order them. And I think that for most countries who've been on the receiving end of these orders, historically, they do comply with them. And so South Africa has no alternative. It has to go to the court to get the orders. And then hopefully political pressure will be put on Israel to get it to comply. Already we're seeing the consequences on Israel with many of its allies and friends. Many of the countries that have been very supportive and friendly to Israel are losing their taste for this, partly because they also value and respect the International Court of Justice. They can't stomach Israel's attitude of absolute disdain for an order by a court. Israel accepted this. Israel never had to ratify the Genocide Convention, but once it did, it opened the door to orders from the International Court of Justice, and it is obliged to respect them.
Alon Liel, how does Israel continue to justify rejecting these orders from the International Court of Justice? Is Israel above the law?
No, I explained how Israel justifies it. It takes the word, if it may inflict, and so on. But the headlines in the world are that the court ordered Israel to end the operation in Rafah. And definitely this will trigger more criticism, some of it probably in the UN and some of it bilaterally. I don't think this International Court of Justice order is standing on its own. You have simultaneously several things happening now in Israel's foreign relations that are causing what we call here a tsunami or a diplomatic tsunami, and Israel has to look at the wider picture. Definitely we are losing support in more and more parts of the world, especially in Europe now, that is seen as very important to us.
Yeah, certainly, Alon Liel, this has been a bad week for Israel. How concerned are Israelis about this growing international pressure and this growing international isolation? It's not just this latest ruling by the International Court of Justice, it's also the ICC seeking to issue arrest warrants against Israeli leaders and also Hamas leaders, and some very important European countries, as you mentioned, who are now demanding that an independent Palestinian state be established. How does this resonate with the Israeli public at large?
The Israeli public is not too concerned. Unfortunately, an attitude was developed with most of the Israeli public that no matter what we do, the world will be against us, as the world is by definition anti-Semitic. So there is a tendency to overlook what's happening in the international community. On the other hand, many Israelis are really, really worried that if we end the war, Hamas will have a comeback and will attack us again. So this is the feeling in the public. However, Netanyahu will be the one making the decision. He can decide on his own. He has in his cabinet some ministers who say, let's go the diplomatic way. Others are pushing for the military way. And he has to decide.
Yeah. All right. Mohammad, Dahleh, your thoughts about this. Alon Liel says there a different interpretation of this latest ruling by Israel, and Israel views these decisions made at the international level as anti-Semitic. What do you make of this?
Well, I think, as you know, Israel has sent a judge, ad hoc judge Barak, who is part of the International Court of Justice. And I think now Israel is trying basically to base its case on his dissenting opinion. In his opinion, he tried to say that actually the International Court of Justice is not ordering a total freeze of the military offensive in Rafah, but actually it does so with certain conditions that if they are met, then Israel should stop the operation. But if Israel doesn't inflict this physical damage to the Palestinian civil population, then the operation can continue. So that's the explanation that Barak, in his opinion, when it was issued, that's what he actually presented to the Israeli government, to the Israeli Attorney General, basically giving advice to the Israeli army. Yet, reading the decision of the 13 judges in the court, they say that actually there is no way to operate in Rafah without inflicting this damage on the civilian population. They mentioned what Israel has tried to do with the several hundreds Palestinians that they evacuated from Rafah to Al-Mawasi area and other areas. And the court says in its ruling that those areas are not adequate for habilitation. People cannot really live there. There are no houses, no water, no sewage, nothing. Therefore, the interpretation given by the Israelis, I think, will not be accepted by anybody in the world. But that's how Israel got away with it until now. All the time, Israel has its own interpretation to international law, including international humanitarian law, and that was only an Israeli interpretation that was different from what the world scholars think about international humanitarian law.
Briefly, Mohammad Dahleh, before I bring William back into the conversation, the ruling also says Israel has to allow UN investigators into Gaza to investigate the genocide case, right? What's the likelihood of that happening, of Israel allowing investigators into the territory?
It hasn't allowed in the past. Several UN inquiry commissions were supposed to come to the Palestinian territories in the past based on different resolutions of the United Nations, General Assembly, Human Rights Council, or other committees. And Israel in the past hasn't been cooperative. And this time, I don't think it's going to be any different. Israel, this is actually, this shows the case of Gaza. Gaza has been besieged. Gaza is still under Israeli full control from the sea, from the air, and from the border, the territorial borders. No one can enter Gaza without an Israeli permit or an Israeli consent. And Israel is the only one who decides who comes and who goes out of Gaza. And therefore, I think that the Israelis will not allow the investigators to come in. So far, they haven't been able to do that. Even Karim Khan, the Attorney General of the ICC, was not able to enter Gaza. He only came to the Rafah cross point, but he was not able to get inside Gaza. He visited the Israeli kibbutzim inside Israel, but he wasn't able to get inside Gaza, although he got the information from other UN agencies. But entering into Gaza is a totally different story.
So
and Israel,
unlikely to happen.
All the time is hindering that.
Unlikely to happen. And William, will a defiance of this order, my understanding is that there's no immediate sanction for violating the provisional orders issued by the International Court of Justice. But does the ruling have broader implications for the genocide case that Israel is facing?
Well, in principle, it doesn't. It's a preliminary ruling about an urgent situation, and it's without prejudice, as we lawyers say, to the merits of the case. But clearly, the attitude and the violence, we can sense the attitude of the judges already. I think Israel's approach in reading this order in this very technical manner and suggesting that somehow it allows them to continue with business as usual is really not a reading in good faith. You have to read the judgments. You have to read what the other members of the court have said in their individual opinions. And one can sense that this is a court that is getting more angrier and angrier and more impatient with Israel. So Israel is not heading into a good place in this case. Right. Of course, there's going to be a great debate when this finally goes on the merits, but it's not looking good for Israel in terms of its future at the International Court of Justice.
What about at the International Criminal Court? Will a defiance of this order by Israel affect the pre-trial chamber of the ICC, which is currently debating whether to issue arrest warrants against Israeli leaders?
Not technically, of course not, because it has the two are not directly related in any way. Right. But again, what we can see here, listen, there are 13 judges of the court from all over the world, from countries that are friendly to Israel, as well as countries that are perhaps less friendly to Israel, and they're unanimous about this. We can expect the same kind of sentiment, the same kind of mood amongst the three judges at the pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court, who are going to have to rule in the coming weeks on the prosecutor's application for the arrest warrants. Of course, we can't foresee what they'll decide, but this sets the tone. And I think we can anticipate that those arrest warrants will be issued. And there are all kinds of other sort of soft effects of this that go outside of the legal sphere altogether. And we've made reference to them already. The fact that there's an increasing number, a growing momentum of states to recognize Palestine as a state and probably open the door. Still, the United States is an obstacle, but it's the last obstacle to admitting Palestine as a full member state of the United Nations.
Right. And Mohammad, I'll ask you about this, the U.S. being this obstacle. But let me just get Alon Liel's thoughts about what William said there. I mean, what happens, Alon, if these arrest warrants are issued? Israel's credibility has radically diminished within the course of this war on Gaza. There's a shifting perception today in the world of Israel as a law-abiding democracy. What would it mean for Israel to lose that status and to be treated as a non-democracy?
Oh, as far as I remember, 124 countries, members of the International Criminal Court, will have to arrest Netanyahu and Gallant, our Minister of Defense, if orders are issued. So this definitely is quite an embarrassment and quite a complication to our foreign relations. Israel will try to undermine it legally. The visits to the United States are still possible, even if orders will be issued, because the United States is not a member of the ICC. I think at this stage, from all the discussion, the issue that is the most urgent one in Israeli eyes is if it will reach the Security Council, because as far as I understand, every one of the 15 members of the Security Council can now pull it to a discussion there. And in the Security Council, it'll be very difficult for the United States to vote against a verdict or an order of the International Court of Justice. So in a way, we are complicating the international situation with the United States if it moves again to the Security Council. So a lot is happening simultaneously, and definitely embarrassing to Israel.
Embarrassing to Israel. Mohammad Dahleh, only the Security Council has the power to enforce these rulings by the International Court of Justice. But as we've heard from both William and Alon Liel there, it's likely that the US will veto any moves at the Security Council. So what then should be done to enforce these rulings, and how difficult a position does this put the US in? I mean, they've backed Israel throughout this conflict. How difficult will it be for them if this gets to the Security Council?
I think it puts the United States in a very difficult position. I mean, for how long can the US use the veto to rescue Israel from its troubles and from the troubles that they are putting the United States in as well? We're not talking about the ICC now. We have heard what the Israelis are asking the US administration to do to the ICC Attorney General and to the judges and to the employees at the ICC. They want them to sanction the court. We haven't heard such a thing ever. I mean, asking the superpower to sanction an international court for issuing a motion only for the time being to ask for an arrest warrant for war criminals. This is unheard of, unthinkable of. But now we are moving to the ICC, and the ICC is an organ of the United Nations, and the United States is part of that order. It's part of the ICC. It's part of the United Nations. Unlike it's part of the ICJ. Unlike the ICC, which the United States is not part of it.
It's not part of the Rome Statute.
This puts the United States in a very awkward position. And basically saying that this world order that we established after the Second World War, which includes the UN Charter and it includes the International Court of Justice and so many other international covenants and conventions and agreements that are supposed to regulate relations between peoples, between countries, between states, that those are not applicable in the case of Israel. The United States has been under a huge embarrassment for its treatment to Israel in this current conflict, not now only, but throughout the years. And now it's in really a very, very bad position if it continues to use that veto, because it's going to be clear for all the international community that this move is against international law
Sure.
and against international
Okay,
justice.
let me get William's thoughts about this. William, how much does this heighten the cost for the Biden administration as it continues to be Israel's sole guarantor and defender? And what are the next steps as far as international law is concerned? I mean, what are the obligations of third states in this case?
I wouldn't underestimate the ability of the United States to be hypocritical on these subjects. The United States has been keenly supporting the International Criminal Court when it's investigating the Russians in Ukraine, despite the fact that it claims that the court has no jurisdiction over people who aren't citizens of a member state. Now, of course, they're raising that objection, and they're going to be trying to take measures, apparently, to block the work of the court. It's not the first time they've done it. They tried back in 2002 when it looked like the Rome Statute was going to enter into force, which it did, of course. And then they tried under the Trump administration. But these were really quite pathetic efforts that had no teeth in them in reality. They had very little in the way of practical consequences. And I don't see that they've thought up anything brilliant since then that could actually inflict pain. It's annoyance. It's an annoyance. Disgraceful that they're doing it. But it's not going to stop the International Criminal Court proceeding with what it is set up to do.
Okay. Alon Liel, is Israel and the Israeli government likely to reevaluate its position in the face of intensifying international pressure and intensifying isolation?
It's a difficult question because I don't know if this wave will continue. But if it will continue, if both courts, the ICC and ICJ, will go on with the pressures, if the Security Council will go on voting, if more European countries will recognize Palestine, if it will end up with America in a certain time not vetoing, then Israel will have to listen. I think we are at a critical junction if we give up on our international standing and focus on our security, or if we go after 100% security because of the pressure of the Israeli population. The Israeli government will have to decide if to go now the military way or the diplomatic way.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. Mohammad Dahleh, Alon Liel, Willian Schabas. Thank you to all three of you. And thank you too for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thank you for watching. Bye for now. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.